Betrayal Hub. Subscribe. Subscribe for honest stories about distance, routine, and what really ends relationships. She said it in front of people. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just sharp enough to land. We were standing near the demo screen after the presentation, surrounded by investors pretending to be relaxed. My wife, Claire, had her hand wrapped around a glass of sparkling water, shoulders squared, eyes already halfway turned away from me. I leaned in, barely touching her arm, the way I always did when the room felt too crowded. She sighed, rolled her eyes, and said it like a correction, not an insult. Stop asking for touch. You're not a child. A few people smiled awkwardly, the way they do when they pretend not to hear something they absolutely heard. Someone laughed too late. Someone else suddenly needed to check their phone. I didn't say anything. I didn't move my hand away fast or slow. I just let it fall, like gravity had finally been allowed to do its job. Claire turned back to them instantly, already explaining a feature, already confident again. She was in her element. Commanding. Efficient. Untouchable. I stood there a second longer than necessary, then stepped back into the edge of the room, where the lights didn't quite reach. From there, I could see everything without being seen. Her posture changed when she spoke to him. Mark. The consultant they'd brought in to help scale the side project. Taller than me. Calmer than me. Hands always in his pockets, like he had nothing to prove. He didn't touch her. That was the thing. He didn't lean in or mirror her movements. He just listened. When she spoke, he didn't interrupt or nod too much. He waited, and when he answered, it was measured, precise, like he wasn't hoping for approval. Later, as people started drifting out, Claire crossed the room toward me, still energized, still riding the success of the pitch. She asked if I was ready to head home. Her tone was neutral, professional, the same tone she used with her team. I said yes. Of course I did. In the car, she scrolled through messages, smiling once at something on her screen. The glow lit her face, softened it in a way I hadn't seen aimed at me in a long time. When we got home, she went straight to the bedroom to take a call. I changed and stood in the kitchen, listening to her voice through the wall. Focused, warm, engaged. I slept that night with my back to her, staring at the dark, already adjusting to the space between us. The first crack didn't come from her. It came from someone who had no reason to protect the silence. A few days later, I met Ethan for lunch. We'd worked together years ago, long before Claire's side project became a serious thing. He now handled infrastructure audits for startups that grew too fast. He chose the place, casual, loud enough that no one listened too closely. He talked about numbers first. Burn rates. Bottlenecks. The usual. Then he mentioned Claire's project, casually, like an afterthought. Said Mark was impressive. Said the board liked him. Said something else right after, quieter, like he wasn't sure if he should. He said Mark had extended his stay after the presentation. That there were 2 hotel rooms booked under the project account, but only 1 badge scanned the next morning. He didn't frame it as gossip. He framed it as data. Something that didn't align. I nodded once. Took a sip of water. Let him keep talking. Ethan noticed my reaction. Or the lack of one. He slowed down, then stopped. Asked if everything was okay at home. I said yes. That answer ended the conversation. That evening, Claire came back later than usual. She said they'd been reviewing post-launch metrics. She didn't look at me when she said it. She set her bag down carefully, like noise mattered more than truth. I didn't ask questions. I made dinner like I always did. Same routine. Same plates. Same silence. She sat across from me, phone face down on the table for once. Ate quickly. Efficiently. When I reached for her out of habit, not even consciously, she shifted her chair back a few inches. Not dramatically. Just enough. She reminded me she'd asked for space. Her voice was controlled. Not unkind. Final. I nodded. I adjusted. I pulled my hand back and folded it into my lap. That night, she showered with the door locked. Steam curled under the frame. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the water, to her humming softly, something unfamiliar. When she came out, she went straight to bed and turned away. I stayed up, scrolling through project dashboards on my tablet. Access I still had. Logs I'd helped design. Nothing invasive. Nothing hidden. Just patterns. A calendar entry moved. A travel expense approved twice. A shared folder created, then renamed. By the time I lay down beside her, the space between us wasn't emotional anymore. It was operational. I didn't confront her. I didn't dig through her phone or wait for a confession that would never come clean. I stayed inside the systems I already owned. In the mornings, Claire left earlier. Not rushed, just precise. Dressed like every day mattered. She stopped asking if I needed anything. Stopped commenting on what I wore. The absence of friction felt intentional, like she was preserving energy for somewhere else. I kept my routine intact. Coffee, gym, work. At night, I sat on the far end of the couch while she answered messages that never seemed urgent but always demanded her attention. She angled the screen away without realizing she was doing it. I noticed small changes first. Shared folders created under neutral names. A new expense category added to the project budget. Consulting travel approved without the usual review loop. None of it illegal. None of it accidental. One afternoon, I stayed late at my office and logged into the back-end environment I'd built months ago. Not to spy, to verify integrity. The logs didn't lie. Access times aligned too perfectly. Late evenings, early mornings, always from different locations, but always paired. I didn't screenshot anything. I didn't forward files. I just watched. That night, Claire came home lighter than usual. She hummed while washing her hands. Set her phone face down again, like it was a courtesy. She talked about traction, about momentum, about how rare it was to work with someone who didn't need reassurance every 5 minutes. She didn't look at me when she said that last part. After dinner, she took a call on the balcony. The door slid shut softly. I stayed inside, clearing the table slowly, deliberately. When her voice drifted back through the glass, it wasn't hushed. It was steady, confident, familiar in a way it hadn't been with me in months. I went to the guest room and opened the closet. The bed was untouched, still neatly made, like it had been waiting for permission. Later, she found me there, sitting on the edge of the mattress. She asked if something was wrong. Her tone was calm, managerial. I said no. I said I just needed space to think. She nodded once, like that was reasonable, like it was temporary. She went back to the bedroom without argument. I lay down fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the apartment settle. Somewhere between the quiet and the distance, the last uncertainty cleared. This wasn't confusion. It was alignment. And I stopped reaching for anything that wasn't already reaching back. I didn't announce anything. There was no line in the sand, no dramatic shift she could point to later and say that's when it started. I just changed the settings and let the system run. I moved my things into the guest room while she was out one afternoon. Not everything, just enough. Clothes, laptop, charger, toothbrush. The bed finally got used. When she came home and noticed, she paused in the hallway, like she was recalculating something. She asked if we needed to talk. Her voice stayed even. I said no. I said this worked better for my sleep. That was true. It worked better for everything. From that point on, our conversations became logistical. Groceries, bills, schedules, clean, predictable exchanges with no edges. I didn't ask how her day went. I didn't comment on her late nights. I didn't touch her arm when she passed by. She noticed the absence before she noticed the reason. She started lingering in shared spaces, standing in the kitchen longer than necessary, sitting on the couch after dinner instead of retreating to her phone. Once, she reached for the remote at the same time I did, our fingers brushing briefly. She froze. I didn't. I pulled my hand back and let her have it. Her trips increased. Short ones, supposedly. Always tied to the project. She stopped over-explaining them when I stopped reacting. She packed carefully now, watching me from the corner of her eye as she zipped her bag. I wished her a safe flight every time. Same tone. Same words. Like a coworker. While she was gone, I closed the joint account we used for discretionary spending and rerouted my income. Nothing dramatic. Just quiet adjustments. She didn't notice until her card declined on a coffee run. She texted me a screenshot. I replied with a brief explanation and an apology for the inconvenience. She said we should talk when she got back. I said okay. When she returned, she stood in the doorway of the guest room for a moment, looking at the setup. The neutral colors. The lack of personal clutter. The absence of her. She asked if this was permanent. I said I didn't know. I said I was focused on stability. That word landed differently than the others. She nodded slowly, like she understood, but her eyes didn't leave my face. Not searching, measuring. That night, she stayed awake long after the lights were off. I could hear her shifting in the other room. I slept through it. The project didn't collapse. It tilted. I never contacted Mark. I didn't need to. Systems talk to each other if you let them. People do too, especially when they think they're speaking into a vacuum. During one of Claire's trips, I forwarded a routine infrastructure report to a distribution list that technically already had access to it. I didn't flag anything. I didn't add commentary. I just removed one layer of insulation that had been protecting assumptions from scrutiny. The report showed timeline compression, vendor overlap, consulting hours that didn't match deliverables. Nothing scandalous on its own. Enough to trigger questions from people whose job was to ask them. I went on with my days. Work, gym, groceries. When Claire called in the evenings, her tone had changed. Still controlled, but tighter around the edges. She talked faster, paused less. She mentioned meetings that ran long. Stakeholders who suddenly needed clarification. Mark's name came up more often. Not with warmth, with irritation. She said he was distracted, that he'd missed a detail he normally wouldn't, that he'd been less available. She framed it as pressure, as growth pains. I listened without interrupting. When she got back, she moved differently through the apartment, like the walls had shifted while she was gone. She asked more questions than before. Not about me, about timing, about finances, about how long I planned to stay in the guest room. I answered everything calmly, precisely, no emotion, no leverage. One evening, she brought up Mark directly, said he was under review, said someone had raised concerns about boundaries, not personal ones, professional. She watched my face closely when she said it. There was nothing to see. I asked if she needed help untangling anything on the technical side. She said no. Too quickly. After that, the calls stopped happening in shared spaces. She took them outside, in the car, on walks that took longer than usual. She stopped humming. At a small dinner with friends a week later, someone asked how the project was going. Claire hesitated before answering. Just a beat. Long enough for the table to notice. She said it was evolving. No one followed up. On the drive home, she stared out the window instead of at her phone. Her reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar. Older. Sharper. When we got back, she stood in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, and said she felt like things were slipping. I said transitions were normal. She turned toward me then, fully, like she was seeing the distance for the first time. I was already out of reach. The shift became visible to other people before she admitted it to herself. Her mother noticed first. At a weekend gathering that had been on the calendar for months, Claire arrived late and distracted. She hugged everyone quickly, like she was already behind. When her mother asked where I was, Claire glanced toward the door to the guest room, then said I'd stayed home to finish something. I had driven separately. At the table, conversations overlapped. Work updates, travel plans, small talk that usually flowed around Claire like water around stone. This time it stalled. She checked her phone repeatedly, then stopped when she realized no new messages were coming. Someone asked about the project. Not aggressively, just curiosity. Claire answered with rehearsed optimism, but the words didn't land. She talked about pivots and alignment and long-term value. No one interrupted. No one leaned in. Her sister asked if Mark was still involved. The question came out sideways, wrapped in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Claire paused again, just a fraction too long. She said yes, but it sounded like a question. Across the room, I watched without engaging. I refilled drinks, cleared plates, operated on the edges of the scene. People noticed that too. A few glances, a few raised brows. No one asked me anything directly. That was worse for her than a confrontation. On the drive back, she said the evening felt strange. She said people were acting different. She said she didn't understand why. I said nothing. The next week, her calendar thinned. Meetings canceled or shortened. Mark's name disappeared from shared threads. She stopped taking calls in the apartment because there were fewer to take. She started sitting in the guest room doorway in the evenings, leaning against the frame like she might cross it if invited. She asked neutral questions. About my day, about dinner plans, about whether I'd be home later. I answered politely, fully, without warmth. One night, she asked if I was angry. The words sounded foreign in her mouth. I said no. That answer unsettled her more than anger ever would have. She began telling mutual friends that I was distant, that work had changed me, that she missed how things used to be. They nodded sympathetically, but their eyes drifted toward me when she wasn't looking. Distance is hard to explain when the person standing next to you is calm. By the end of the week, She stopped pretending she was in control. Everyone else already knew. She started coming home earlier. Not because she wanted to, because there was nowhere else to go. The project no longer demanded late nights. The calls stopped filling the gaps. Whatever intensity she'd borrowed from that other orbit had burned out, leaving quiet behind. She tried to bring that quiet into the apartment like it was something we could share. I didn't meet her halfway. She hovered more. In the kitchen while I cooked. In the hallway when I moved between rooms. She asked if I needed help with anything, then stood there after I said no, like she was waiting for a follow-up that never came. I stayed predictable. Gym in the mornings. Work during the day. Dinner at the same hour. Dishes done immediately. No complaints. No questions. No attempts to fill the silence she kept creating. At night, she sat on the edge of her bed scrolling through old photos. I could see the glow under the door. Sometimes she laughed softly at something from years ago. Sometimes she went quiet for long stretches. I didn't check. Friends stopped inviting her out as often. Or maybe they did, and she declined. Either way, she stayed in more. Watched me leave the apartment dressed neatly, focused, unavailable. She tried small gestures. Buying my favorite groceries. Leaving a note on the counter reminding me about an appointment I didn't have. Touching my shoulder once as she passed. Then pulling her hand back like she'd crossed a line. I acknowledged everything with the same calm neutrality. One evening, she asked if we could sit together. Not to talk, just to sit. She framed it carefully, like a feature request she didn't want rejected outright. I said I was tired. That was also true. She nodded and retreated, slower than before. Her confidence drained in increments. Shoulders slumped. Clothes chosen less sharply. She checked her phone more often again, but now with urgency instead of excitement. Whatever she expected to find there didn't arrive. I could feel her watching me when she thought I wasn't aware. Measuring my distance. Testing it with her presence. Failing every time. She asked if I missed her. The question came out late one night, almost casually, like she hadn't rehearsed it. I said I was getting used to how things were. That landed hard. Harder than any accusation. From then on, she stopped pretending she just wanted space. She wanted access. I stayed where I was. Just out of reach. The confrontation didn't happen in a burst. It arrived quietly, the way things do when there's nowhere left to hide. She waited until an evening when I was already home, already settled, already unreachable. She stood in the doorway of the guest room again, but this time she didn't lean. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She said we needed to talk. Not urgently. Carefully. Like she'd finally understood that pressure wouldn't work. I stayed seated on the edge of the bed, hands resting on my knees, posture neutral. I didn't invite her to sit. She didn't. She said she felt shut out. That the distance felt intentional now. That she didn't know where she stood with me anymore. Her voice stayed controlled, but the pace was off. Too many words trying to sound reasonable. She said she hadn't meant to hurt me. That the project had consumed her. That working with Mark had felt easy. Uncomplicated. She stopped short of naming anything directly, like if she avoided the shape of it, it might stay smaller. I listened without reacting. No nodding. No tightening. Just stillness. She stepped closer. Asked if I'd already made a decision. Asked if this was punishment. Asked if I was planning to leave. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was choosing words. Because silence had become the only honest response. She filled it quickly. She said she missed how connected we used to be. How natural things were. She said she felt like she was living with a stranger who knew all her habits, but none of her needs. That was the first time her voice cracked. I stood up then. Not abruptly. Just enough to change the dynamic. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her I wasn't confused. I told her I had adjusted to the conditions she'd set. That was all. She stared at me like she was waiting for the rest. For reassurance. For a door to open. Nothing came. She asked if I still loved her. The question landed heavy, stripped of strategy. I didn't answer it. I told her I was stepping out for a walk. I told her I'd be back later. Same calm tone I used for everything now. When I passed her, she didn't move. She didn't reach out. Behind me, the door stayed closed. By the time I returned, the apartment was dark. She was awake. I could feel it. But she didn't come looking. She finally understood I wasn't negotiating anymore. Her collapse wasn't loud. It didn't come with tears in the kitchen or messages sent too late at night. It came in fragments, scattered across ordinary days. She missed a deadline at work. Not catastrophically, just enough for someone else to notice. She forgot a meeting she'd scheduled herself. When she realized, she laughed it off in front of her team, but her hands shook when she set her phone down afterward. Mark disappeared from her vocabulary completely. Not replaced. Erased. Whatever had existed there ended without ceremony, like something that only lived as long as it wasn't tested. At home, she moved carefully now, like the apartment was a space she no longer owned. She asked before using the washer, before changing the thermostat, before planning anything that assumed my presence. I stayed consistent, polite, distant. I didn't withdraw further. I didn't soften either. One evening, she came home with red eyes and no explanation. She sat at the kitchen table long after dinner, staring at nothing. I cleaned up around her without comment. Later, I heard her on the phone in her room. Her voice was low, unsteady. She wasn't explaining anymore. She was asking for advice, for reassurance, for something to hold on to. Whatever she heard on the other end didn't help. Friends stopped checking in as much. Her mother called less often. The social orbit that once reflected her confidence back to her had shifted, quietly, without announcement. She tried to reinsert herself into my routines. Asked if I wanted to grab coffee together. If I wanted to watch something. If I wanted company on a walk. I declined gently. Every time. One night, I came home later than usual. The apartment was dark except for a lamp in the living room. She was sitting there, knees pulled in, phone resting on the cushion beside her like it had given up. She looked smaller. Not physically. Energetically. She said she felt invisible. That she didn't recognize her life anymore. That everything felt unstable. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't step closer. She asked if I was happier like this. The question wasn't strategic. It was raw. I said I was calm. That word ended the conversation. She nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting that answer all along, but needed to hear it anyway. When she went to bed, she left the door open. An invitation. A signal. I stayed where I was. By then, she understood the cost of what she'd dismissed. And there was no one left to absorb the fall for her. The last moment didn't arrive with an argument. It came on an ordinary morning, quiet enough to be missed if you weren't already paying attention. I packed a small bag and left it by the door. Not hidden, not emphasized, just there. When she noticed it, she didn't ask what it was for. She already knew. She moved through the apartment slowly, like every step needed confirmation. Made coffee she didn't drink. Straightened a chair that was already aligned. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady in a way it hadn't been for weeks. She said she understood now. That she hadn't before. She said she'd mistaken my calm for needlessness. That she thought closeness was something she could ration without consequence. She didn't mention Mark. She didn't need to. She said she missed me. I stood near the door, jacket on, keys in hand. I didn't interrupt her. I let her finish every sentence, even the ones that trailed off unfinished. She stepped closer, stopping just short of touching me. She looked up, searching my face for something familiar. Some signal that the distance had done its job and could be reversed. I told her I hadn't disappeared. I told her I'd simply stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. She closed her eyes briefly, like she'd been bracing for that exact sentence. When she opened them, there was no negotiation left in them. Just clarity, arriving too late to be useful. She asked what happens now. I told her I was leaving. Not forever. Not dramatically. Just leaving this version of us where it stood. She didn't cry. She nodded once, the way she did in meetings when a decision was final. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. As I opened the door, she said my name. Not urgently. Not desperately. Just once. I turned and looked at her. Really looked. At the woman who had once rolled her eyes at my need for closeness. At the woman standing alone in a quiet apartment she no longer controlled. I didn't step back. I walked out and closed the door behind me. In the hallway, the silence followed. It didn't chase me. It stayed with her. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't carry it with me. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.